I had to stop there after Romanticism. This is why the second segment is much shorter than the first one, because German idealism is such a heavy topic. I had to kind of go back and review my slides again. At least I felt I needed to. It's part of the reason also that on this section I have so many quotes. Not the same reason why the last section had so many quotes, but the German idealists are difficult to understand. So if you don't understand them, you're not alone. Very abstruse. Much of their work is, as we'll see, very abstract, but they were of enormous influence and are also very much related to the Romantics. And some of the quotes and some of my comments will make that abundantly clear. Keep in mind, they're more or less contemporaries with the Romantics. So this, though we're doing this ism after Romanticism, these are very much tied together. And so then it won't surprise you that the idealists also tended to be Germans, since the Romantic movement, we know, was centered in Germany as well. Immanuel Kant, an Enlightenment thinker, was also a contributor, like Rousseau, to the thinking of the early 19th century, the idealists, and again, they're related to the Romantics. Roland Stromberg wrote a book called the European Intellectual History since 1789, which I quote extensively here. Says Kant came to be regarded as the greatest of modern philosophers. It seemed he brought an end to the typical Enlightenment philosophy by rejecting both its empiricism, right, commitment to knowledge to the senses alone, and confused skepticism, like David Hume, in favor of a new form of rationalism. More sort of philosophical rationalism, not so much scientific reason. The peculiar Enlightenment formula of common sense empiricism was not tenable after his criticisms and reconstructions. It's true that Kant is one of the giants in modern Western philosophy. Ironically, since he was a tiny little guy almost never left his little home university town in Germany, and was incredibly punctual. The neighbors could know it was 3 p.m. If you looked out the window, because if Kant was sort of walking by, it must be 3 because he's taking his walk, from right down our walk here. His house is just down the street, so you could set your watch or your clock by Kant's habits. Stromberg says Kant is pointing out to us that the world must appear to us in a certain way because of the kind of mind as well as the kind of senses we have. The mind imposes order on nature. So Kant believed then that nature isn't necessarily the way we see it. It's likely to be, and he couldn't prove this, of course, but he's saying it's likely to be that the apparatus that we have that can come in contact with nature, sight, hearing, whatever, can only do certain things, and so our own minds, to take in the world in the only way they can, which might not be, sort of what nature is in complete form, and we kind of impose our own will or what our own mind needs to impose. So we see order in nature, but maybe it's not as orderly as we think it is, because our mind requires to order things even if they're disordered. And this would go on to have, again, in many ways, a huge impact on European thought, most of which we're not going to talk about. In his Critique of Pure Reason, one of his many works of philosophy, he's one of the great contributors to ethics. Wrote a lot about ethics as a branch of philosophy. His branch of ethics is usually one of 2 only today that still gets talked about as relevant, but we're not going to get into that. In the book Critique of Pure Reason, among other things, he asked, what can reason do? And in typical philosopher's fashion, he says everything and nothing. I say typical philosopher because philosophers seem to always want to confuse us. What do you mean everything and nothing? That's pretty vague. But he does explain, and I'm simplifying. But he talks about the world of phenomena and the world of noumena. First word you've probably heard of, second one most people haven't. But by phenomena, he meant the physical world, right? Phenomena in the physical world. In the realm of noumena, by the realm of noumena, he meant anything beyond the physical world. So the physical world and kind of beyond the physical world. And everything and nothing, what can reason do? He's saying in the physical world, the world of objects and things, there's no limits to what reason can do. It can do everything. Like science can improve technology and human standard of living because that's the physical world. But in anything beyond the physical world, it can't do anything. Right? So anything spiritual or any aspects of reality that aren't quantifiable can do nothing. So he's a precursor and an influence on thinkers right up until the present day. For instance, the author, scholar that I quoted earlier, Leon Kass, who is concerned about the direction of modern science, and some of the Romantic thinkers themselves who don't believe that science is able to grasp the entire world. Not everything can be quantified, as we said before. So that's at least part of what he's saying in this great work of philosophy. If it had stopped there, the idealists would be a little more understandable, but things start sort of spinning in a more incomprehensible direction. That's not to say that the thinkers that we're talking about now weren't great philosophers in their own right and didn't contribute something of value. It's just they become increasingly harder to understand. So again, I'm quoting them or quoting good authors about them accordingly. Friedrich Schelling shows sort of the connection between Romanticism and idealism. He's one of those that does. A disciple of Fichte, we'll get to that, and friend and collaborator of Hegel, he developed what he called transcendental idealism. Already that sounds more difficult to deal with. He put greater stress than Fichte on physical nature as the objective form of the absolute, the capital A, and pointed out the road Hegel was to follow in many respects. Perhaps the most striking feature of his thought was its representation of the artistic creation, the act of aesthetic intuition, as the supreme achievement. It is in art that the infinite manifests itself in finite form. Coleridge and all the Romantic poets absorbed Schelling eagerly, not surprisingly, and for understandable reasons. He provided a metaphysical basis for the artist such as had never before been known. So he gives the artists sort of an importance that they loved, of course. Romanticism's glorification of the poet as seer, as unacknowledged legislator of the human race, as discoverer and purveyor of loftier truths than the merely logical, relates closely to Schelling's thought. We're going to skip the quote on the right, but Isaiah Berlin, again, is always worth reading, even if it's a blurb on your own, I'm saying. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, another of the German idealists. You can just see by the last names that these are pretty German dudes. Lots of, guttural sounds in here. As Tim Blanding says, Fichte adopted and preached a philosophy of idealism, believing that anything else leads to determinism and materialism, which destroy human dignity. According to the version of reality that Fichte developed, the universe consists of an absolute ego, capital E, which is like our own consciousness, a unique free activity which strives to realize itself in perfect self-awareness and is the foundation of all nature. This vision of reality dramatized the human will or consciousness as hub and center of the universe, because an expression of the absolute spirit of which the universe consists. Spirit or idea makes up reality. If Fichte was not a romantic, he introduced an intoxicating idea, which in the broader sense was very romantic, that the world is spiritual, that we are part of that spiritual world, and that in moral experience especially we can touch the uttermost sublimities of the universe. So he believed that the world itself was spiritual to its core. Sort of the whole world, the universe, was infused with spirituality and with idea, with thought as well. That sort of these things exist sort of outside of human experience. They're already out there, kind of in the ether. And subsequent idealist philosophy, which we're not going to get into specifically, went so far, this is where it, I think, spun out of control after these guys, that some of the philosophers started to claim that the only thing that is real in the world is human thought. That's it. Nothing else. There really is no other world except human thought. That's it. Kant had sort of started down that road. Remember, by saying that, well, the universe, right? We kind of organize it the way we want to in our heads. But he certainly didn't deny that the world existed outside of a human being's own brain. But the later idealists, and with these two guys, Fichte and Schelling in between, went that far. Which brings us to the gigantic intellectual influence of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. If you don't read Hegel, read about him, which I would advise. The German authors of this period and beyond are well known, even when it's translated into English, of course, for writing sentences that go on forever and ever and ever, and being like so opaque that you want to bang your head against a wall after like 10 minutes, if not less. So I have to admit, I never got through one of Hegel's books on my own, and I can usually read almost anything with glee. So what I did was read a lot about Hegel. He's worth learning about, even if you can't get through his work. If you can, you're sort of better at this than I am. Roland Stromberg, again, because Hegel is tough to understand, but I will try to translate this afterwards. Hegel's was a vast, labyrinthine, and to some impenetrable system which, despite its difficulties, exercised enormous influence. I screwed up that quote already, just the way I wrote it. I'll have to go back and change it. For those who believed Hegel, history and human affairs no longer were chaotic, jumbled, or meaningless. Every great event had its place in an unfolding plot, which when the book was finished would be seen to have no loose ends, nothing put in without purpose. Hegel's approach to human history was a revelation. Behind the apparently fortuitous jumble of events, the philosopher-historian can discern a great process at work, according to Hegel, which is nothing else than thought, the idea, working itself out in reality. Hegel saw nothing less than God's will immanent in the world, the unrolling of a great purpose. History is a logical, rational process. It was an exciting idea. It stimulated great interest in the subject of history. All historians probably owe their basic professional debt to Hegel. That's true. We should study the actions, the empirical events, but we should not stop there. We should think them through to discover their inner logic. The world is in motion, a dialectical process. Progress is made, things proceed towards fuller freedom, and eventually to absolute, complete self-realization, or the absolutes, again with a capital. Hegel was the philosopher of process and of organism. No creature is absolutely free, but free only to realize its natural possibilities. A person realizes his freedom by developing his rational potential, but he must live in an organized state, obey its laws, and serve the interests of the community. He stressed the state as the highest unit. So, we have to unpack this. Let's do the last part first. Though Hegel believed in human freedom and was overall a supporter of capitalism, he did believe that humans sort of owed their ultimate loyalty to the state, the government, and he actually believed that human beings worked out their freedom primarily and at least more fully through the state, assuming the state was organized well enough. And he happened to believe that his state, Prussia, was the most well organized that it had sort of ever been. So in a sense, he's seeing that things are coming kind of the natural purpose, which is kind of perfectly rational and organized societies and states, people within them, in Prussia. He's a bit biased there. His philosophy puts history at its center. And part of what was exciting about his idea is that he's saying that history does have a purpose, and history is teleological. It is moving in a direction. It's moving towards progress. And the progress is that reason is unfolding, and reason is making things better. Humans are getting better as their capacity to reason improves, generation after generation, century after century. Now, Hegel is certainly in some ways an idealist philosopher, so that's why I put him in with the German idealists, and he's the culmination of their work because, like them, he sees sort of something above and beyond human existence in the everyday, physical world, like Fichte and Schelling, in sort of an absolute spirit or idea. So he believed that human reason and logic and spirit were sort of out there in the ether, already there, just waiting for human beings to kind of connect or understand it, which sounds completely outrageous until we realize that we're used to thinking in quite similar ways, at least many of us. If you believe in God, well, where does God exist? Where does God live? Out there somewhere, nowhere, everywhere. So it's no more, vague than that. But it is still vague. So Hegel sees the world then as sort of inevitably unfolding in a rational, progress-oriented direction. Not so much material or economic progress as the Enlightenment figures, philosophers believed, though that too, but sort of improving morally as they go along. So he believed that the world was sort of universal reason and spirit, guided by it, moving in that direction throughout history. He talks about the cunning of reason. And what that really means is that at one time or another in history, you can see one country, one leader, like Napoleon, sometimes maybe more than one at the same time, that are kind of on the leading edge of progress, moving history in the direction of reason and kind of perfection, moral improvement, and it's not always clear what it is about them that's moving in that direction at the time. Like Napoleon, he did believe Napoleon was that leader in his time. But one can ponder and say, wait a minute, Napoleon was moving the world towards sort of better, morality and greater sort of reason in a moral way. But it's sort of like, God's mysterious ways. The world spirit, by the way, is in a sense Hegel's God. So this is, very complex stuff because it gets into things metaphysical, right? The ultimate sort of purpose and meaning of life and the world and humanity. So this isn't child's play, to be sure. He believed that everything was always in motion. Again, process, organic development. This is the part that's really influenced historians because it's been drilled into our heads now to think in terms of development and process. You can't really understand history, honestly, without thinking in those terms. To understand how things sort of connect and change and evolve over time. The importance of state institutions, bureaucrats, again, already kind of stated, read from the quote there, but he believed that Prussia was sort of the, almost perfect state, and as abstract as his thinking and writing can be, he did do some lectures, and some of them got published, that were much more down to earth about his sort of guidance on politics, institution building, bureaucracy, and he thought the role of civil servants, well-educated, very thoughtful, gifted civil servants were crucial to any society's and state's success. I saved the top left for last because we're going to sort of get back to this. But Hegel's dialectic and his total philosophy, we'll get to that in a second too. As I said before, this is complicated. So Hegel's dialectic goes back to and takes from the Greek version of the dialectic. The dialectical process has three components. Perhaps you know about it: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And the thesis is sort of something or phenomenon, institution, or idea that exists. It naturally kind of develops its antithesis, so the thinking goes, meaning its opposite or opposition, and there's eventually a conflict between the thesis and antithesis that ends up in some synthesis, which means they bring things together, they kind of compromise, they meld together, even, not necessarily intentionally. Sometimes one defeats the other, but there's still some residue of influence from the losing side. And then that synthesis becomes a new thesis, which then in turn develops its own antithesis. And so this is a way to explain history and historical development and change over the long haul, because it's constantly going from thesis to antithesis to synthesis. That synthesis becomes another thesis, and on and on and on and on. So this is how we it's through that structure that Hegel sort of fit his whole view of history and sort of laid it all out. One of the reasons that I'm stopping on this now is because Karl Marx, who will be a big figure going forward in our class, was a student of Hegel's, not literally in the classroom, but everybody was a student of Hegel's in the mid to late 19th century, because he had that much influence on every subject. So Marx definitely knew his Hegel, and then, not surprisingly at all, he picked up the dialectic in his own thinking. As historians often say, Marx turned Hegel on his head. So we'll get to that when we, in due course. But he did use the dialectic to help explain history himself. Total philosophy, for our purposes, just remember that this was an attempt to kind of explain all of sort of human life and the world and history. So this is a totalizing philosophy, a grand narrative, a meta-narrative, as they're sometimes called today. So this is an attempt to kind of explain it all. And these kind of all-encompassing philosophies are now wildly unpopular, and for good reason. They're quite ambitious. But I'm not so sure there aren't some big narratives that aren't worth at least thinking about, at least more modern ones than this. So now we get to yet another ism, and now we're moving kind of into more political isms. Nationalism is certainly one of those. Do not tell me how pale France is. She has shed her blood for you. Right? So that sounds like it is a very ultra-patriotic statement from, I forget which Frenchman that is. And patriotism and nationalism are not synonyms, but they're related to each other. Patriotism sort of falls under the sort of larger umbrella of nationalism. So what is nationalism? Again, there's lots of ways to define it. We'll see one other one. But I have my own kind of simple, I like sort of broad working definitions for didactic purposes. So that's what I'm doing again here. It's when identity becomes the nation. Right? So when, ask the question, who are you? What are you? Right? All of us have multiple things. We could say, I am a or an. Right? So nobody has sort of one aspect of their identity. Nobody would just, answer that one time and just say, I am this or I am that. Right? Because I'm a teacher. I've played tennis my whole life. I'm a tennis player. I'm a husband. I'm a father. And on and on. So we have multiple aspects to our identity. But the higher one puts their national identity. I'm a Frenchman, right? I'm a German. I'm an American. On their identity sort of I am list, the more nationalistic they are. And so if somebody, and there are certainly these people say, I'm an American. What are you? I'm an American. If that's sort of the first thing you say, then you are nationalistic. And nationalism has fallen on hard times, at least its reputation has. It's widely seen, at least on one side of the political spectrum today, as a terrible thing. But sometimes the word is thrown around rather loosely. So I'm going to try to give you a bit more nuanced vision of nationalism here, and show you that it cuts a number of ways, and it depends on how you define it. So what is nationalism? Where did it come from? What are its deep structures? Is one of its most famous professors, who's an expert on it, says. No surprise here that this came from the French Revolution in many ways. So we already know this, so I'll skip over it. But remember that the Germans, the Italians, everybody else in Europe was sick and tired of being occupied by Napoleon and French forces, and so nationalism was in part sort of a desire, came about in part at first as a desire to drive out the French. But another definition of nationalism by a really good scholar on this subject, Lloyd Kramer, calls it cultural processes that teach people how they are connected to their nations. I would say it more strongly than that, as I did in my definition, but that's still, I think, a good partial definition as well. So the wars of revolution, meaning the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that follows, led to this heightened sense of national identity, and sort of now a sense that you're fighting for ideals, which also comes from the French Revolution. The Germans start to emphasize their own distinctive culture, the folk culture. A guy called Ernst Moritz Arndt, you have a slide on him in a minute, let hatred of the French be your religion. He counseled the German people in a very nice way. Centralized states, right, the European state system, industrialization, urbanization, romanticism, all have their impact on nationalism in ways that we don't really need to get into. The cultural construction of nationalism is interesting and important, I think, to understand what yet another expert on this calls imagined identities. And that means, really what it kind of sounds like, is that in some ways nationalism is made up. It's whatever the government or those in power, those who have a stake or an interest in keeping the country the way it is. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. It sometimes is. But whatever stories they can tell you, whatever symbols they can use to get you to feel strongly identified with the country, that's how this professor is saying that national identities and nationalism is created. So you want to create, if you're on the, if you're part of constructing nationalism, like as a leader, you want to create new and the greatest loyalty to the nation. Old loyalties subdued. We've seen this in a more primitive form with the origin of nation states, modern nation states in the 17th century. Make people feel strongly attached to a particular land and who possess a common language, culture, and history marked by shared glories and sufferings, coming straight from our lovable and cherished author Marvin Perry. Cultural and political nationalism. Here's, I think, where we can dispel some of the more simplistic notions about nationalism being a four-letter word today. There's cultural nationalism and political nationalism, which sometimes overlap, but I think the distinction is important to make to be able to see different ways that you can cut nationalism. Johann Gottfried von Herder, an Italian, no, extremely German, once again, I already mentioned his concept of the folk. Roland Stromberg says, Herder's contribution to nationalism stands out in the intellectual career of a many-sided genius. Romanticism blended with nationalism in his thought. It was a humane and liberal nationalism. It meant to Herder the self-fulfillment of peoples who thereby make their contribution to the brotherhood of man. He went seeking, Herder that is, the songs of the people on the streets, in alleys and fish markets, in the simple life of the peasant folk. He wrote a famous book on the German language, which we'll get to in a minute, but he's famous for going around Germany and finding average people in this or that community and trying to collect and successfully collecting folk music, folk songs, folk stories, and putting them sort of in published volumes, believing that the folk culture, meaning the average person's culture, average German culture, was sort of worth trumpeting and celebrating. So cultural nationalism can be humane and quite open-minded. We tend to focus on its more closed-minded and more tribalistic element today, and you could call this, I think, in Herder's contribution, kind of a benign tribalism, because he's certainly trying to get the German people to feel good about their own culture and society, and be proud of what's distinct about it. But he expects that other peoples will do the same thing. And you don't have to be in competition with them over it. You can just sort of celebrate your culture as you would want to, because it's yours. You're proud of who you are and where you came from, and so is everybody else. So it's not necessarily a competitive thing, though of course it can be. So we wanted to sort of get at the spirit of the people. In his case, the German people. Volksgeist, spirit of the people, as the Germans said it. Political nationalism can get ugly, but even here, it's not necessarily ugly. On the screen, you see that there were movements for political independence of one nation from other authorities, or unification of national groups into one political unit, like unification of Italy and Germany, which we'll get to. So if nationalism is such a bad thing, then you'd have to conclude, or is a bad thing, just across the board, then you'd have to conclude that Indian nationalism, which provided the energy and ideas for the Indian people to unite, rise up, and through a long, mostly peaceful protest movement, drive the British out of India and become thereby independent, governing themselves. That sounds like a perfectly rational and okay thing to do, to put it mildly. So that's a manifestation of nationalism that I don't think you can in any way call something sinister. Even the unification of countries is understandable. It's not always done in humane ways, but it's in and of itself not necessarily a bad thing. The leading intellectual voice of this kind of nationalism was Giuseppe Mazzini. This is an Italian, and his Young Italy movement. Quoting from Stromberg again, Mazzini's prolific and eloquent pen gained him a place as one of the chief writers of his time and a great leader of the Italian Risorgimento, which really was meaning the unification movement. Mazzini was its spiritual leader, believed that all men should be brothers, there should be solidarity, and there should be religion, a religion of humanity. His stress on national liberation and a social democratic mystique put him in the center of the 19th century European ideology. So even political nationalism at Mazzini's hand, with his pen, wasn't threatening to other people. It wasn't sort of saying we're superior to you as a culture and a people. Our nationalism, isn't pushing in the direction of saying you're inferior and we don't want you around, or we're going to conquer you. Though that is the danger, that political nationalism can cross a line, and even cultural, I guess, can cross a line too, from our culture is unique to our culture is better, and can get even more severe than that, when it goes from our culture is better to our culture is so much better that we're going to force it on you, or we're going to force you out of our culture because you don't belong. And the latter is the type of nationalism that we've seen some of today in the world, that is very concerning and dangerous, but it's not the only form of nationalism. Arndt, right, he wrote a song called "What is the Fatherland," but a symbol, an important symbol in his day of rising nationalism, in this case also in Germany. Sort of the common contours leading to these emotionally charged national identities, they're kind of different narratives that can be used, or are used. So one is that we are a superior nation, and kind of setting up kind of an us versus them mentality. That part can get dangerous. That kind of it can certainly get dangerous. At the bottom, narratives of race and ethnicity. We have racially superior stock. That obviously is the most dangerous form of nationalism and nationalist narrative. There's narratives of history. We've done these great things in our history, and therefore we have this important role to play. There's the narrative that says we have a unique national purpose for the world. We're destined. We're sort of ordained by God to do this. And this one is very common. It certainly has arrogance behind it, and sort of ideas of sort of superiority over other people, which can be dangerous. But it's kind of ubiquitous. Jules Michelet, famous French historian, actually, professor, in 1846, wrote a book called The People, talking about the French people, saying the representative of France was the representative of the liberties of all the people of the world, and as the country that links all the others together by sympathetic ties, the true introduction to universal love. Only a Frenchman would say that. Right? He's saying the French we have a kind of a God. We're destined. We're supposed to go around the world and spread love because we understand it better than everybody else. I think you can probably already see that this narrative of nationalism has certainly been shouldered by Americans before and taken on. Right? Americans do democracy or liberty better than anybody else, and hey, we're going to show you how to do it too, whether you like it or not. So again, this can be an overbearing, aggressive, and sometimes violent form of nationalism as well, emotionally charged. But it also sometimes works. So if it's the government or the sort of the mainstream culture, elites, however you want to say it, that are using these narratives to sort of bring on a more emotional attachment to the country, identity, attachment to the country, these tend to work. Again, some of them are dangerous, some of them not, some of them more dangerous than others. Herder, we already mentioned. We can kind of skip through this. He wrote a book called The Treatise on the Origins of Language, 1772, in which he talked about the unique features of the German language, but he really wasn't doing it to try to say German language is superior to everybody else's. He was just sort of being proud of his own language, and thought that it was a good thing for Germans to be proud of their own culture, which I actually do think is a healthy thing. We're supposed to not think that in the United States any longer. But why shouldn't we be proud of those things? I mean, there are things that about America that are worthy of being ashamed of course. But the things that are sort of worthy of being respected and honored and cherished, why shouldn't we do so? Every other people does it. So Herder's an example, as I said already, really, of the healthier form of nationalism. Michelet already talked about. There are commonly constructed symbols, a language, certain vehicles of national identity. Language often invoked, as Herder did with the German language. History, that's a great way to get people on board. Our proud history, learn about this, the glory days of Rome, the Italians, or whatever it might be. That's going back pretty far, but whatever works. Territory, sometimes people get devoted to the very, terra firma, their geographical, sites, landmarks, rivers, mountains, the Alps, whatever it might be, and become extremely proud of that. Religion can be used or is a part of sometimes people coming together, identifying as a nation. Not always, but sometimes. Religion is a powerful way to do it as well. The institutions, certain institutions are instrumental in 19th century Europe, and certain groups. It tended to be pushed more effectively in cities. Schools played a large role. Intellectuals, philosophers, teachers, journalists, novelists, poets, literary critics, all of them, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unwittingly, played the role of purveying nationalism. There are many everyday symbols of nationalism, and I've just picked out a few. Statues, festivals, monuments, public ceremonies, flags, holidays, famous geographic sites, literature, music, sports, clothes, stamps, money, schools, museums, and on and on and on. We generally don't think of most of those things as having anything to do with national identity or pushing kind of a nationalist agenda, and those things aren't just that. Certainly sports is not just about nationalism, but it does in its own way at certain times push in that direction. Now we get to the political isms, and we're not going to cover all of the isms on here, and you can't see all of them anyway. I couldn't find a slide I liked better that was already made, kind of fancy, so I stuck with this, as blurry as it may be. We're going to focus on the three main ones here. There are some others as well. First, liberalism, at least classical liberalism, that is. And this really was the ideology of the middle class. And there are liberal parties. And it's the liberals, the European liberals, that are on the rise. Remember, the liberals are basically the capitalists. They're also the heirs of the Enlightenment tradition. So this is kind of like the Enlightenment fast-forwarded into the early to middle and beyond of the 19th century. So, but the middle class, we tend to think of the middle class as the majority today. And in our country, it is. In some parts of the world, at least in the sort of wealthier countries, it tends to be. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I have a sweater on and it's getting kind of hot in my room, my office. So the ideology of the middle class is actually a small percentage of populations in Europe, no more than like 20%, probably more like 10 to 15%. So it isn't the majority at that time, and yet it starts to become increasingly powerful and punches kind of above its sort of weight category. Because it is the liberals that have been on the rise for a long time in our class. We've traced this conflict between the liberals, the capitalists, right, the new money folks, and the nobles and old money folks back to the 17th century. They've been duking it out, at least politically, culturally, socially, ever since. So this is the ideology, these political parties of a liberal stripe that are going to kind of own Europe, but they're not quite there yet because they still have other ideologies to deal with. So I was going to say something else about liberalism. Oh, yes, to say at the beginning, get this out of the way. Remember that we're not talking about liberalism or conservatism in the modern American sense. That's why I put classical there. Today, since really the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt in this country, and he kind of helped to make the change, not intentionally, but liberal has come to mean something different. Liberal now in this country is really a synonym for progressive. In Europe in the 19th century, liberal didn't mean, a pot-smoking liberal. No, I'm just kidding. But it didn't mean sort of liberal politics as we define them now. It, of course, took its name from the word liberty. And so it, more than anything else, it emphasized individual freedom. The rights, the freedom, the liberty of the individual, going all the way back to the work of John Locke that we've noted earlier. Limited government, right? Belief in the sanctity of private property rights. So classical liberals are really capitalists. And again, this is what the philosophers were as well. So today that would be considered more conservative by modern American standards. This is why we don't want to get confused with the terms themselves. This is classical liberalism. In some ways, it's even more like libertarianism today than it would be we think of as American liberalism. So liberal individualism is sort of the top of the list of this ideology. But remember, these are the capitalists, and they're now knocking at the door of power. They got the money, now they want the political power. Enlightenment thought extended forward, we already said. Scientific reasoning only. So typical, followers, practitioners of the Enlightenment. This group is sort of rejecting anything as knowledge that's not, coming from empirical, science-based, studies done, tests done, data collected. Nothing else is considered legitimate knowledge. This is also the group, the ideology that's most fervently in favor of civil liberties, which is basically, an extension of the, belief value of liberal individualism. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to peaceably assemble, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, etc., etc. Free markets, we already know that. The liberals are extremely reform-minded. Not to say revolutionary. Reform means change, but it means gradual change. And the liberals in Britain and France and other places, they truly believed that Europe needed reforms, as did the philosophers, but they didn't believe in revolution because they didn't think their societies were that decrepit that they required, some sort of radical, violent makeover. Most of whom wouldn't have supported that anyway. Utilitarianism, another ism, kind of a subcategory here, but a great example of liberalism overall, kind of one of its offshoots. Utilitarian philosophy, a guy named Jeremy Bentham, a British thinker, and his friend James Mill, maybe the two most famous at the time, and then Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, the most famous utilitarian, who we'll get to in a later unit. The focus in utilitarianism is on, again, numbers and so things being studied quantitatively. Bentham actually believed that you could quantify pleasure and pain, and he believed that that's what utilitarianism was there to do. Human beings are all about maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain. And he came up with something sometimes called the philosophic calculus. Felicity means kind of happiness. So there's a happiness calculus. And he had these sort of charts so you can compare and try to figure out sort of what would make you most happy. You have to, with anything that you might do, right? He categories like, how long does the pleasure last? How intense is the pleasure? How much does it cost? And then from there, you're supposed to be able to figure out, okay, it's just easy. I just sort of look at my chart here or whatever, and I can decide whether I want to do this or not do it. Okay, there's more pain than pleasure in this. No, it's not worth doing. As if happiness and unhappiness could be, again, calculated like that. But here we see something I've already said multiple times, and that is that there seems to be areas where science and the scientific sort of way of thinking, quantification, mathematics, can't sort of explain everything. It's hard to come up with like a mathematical equation explaining comedy. I'd like you to try, actually. Let me know if you succeed doing that. Political economy, and the political economists like David Ricardo, we already talked about, are a good also example of liberal thinking. Very much reform-minded, free market-minded for sure, and believing in sort of the Enlightenment way of going about thinking and economics. Parliamentary government, so they did believe in representative government, but the liberals were somewhat wary and suspicious of democracy. Not outright rejection of democracy in all cases, but certainly not a full-throated support of democracy. And maybe the quintessential liberal in all these ways, especially the latter, is Alexis de Tocqueville, a French political leader, but most known today for a book that he wrote about the United States. He traveled to the U.S. in the 1830s during the Jackson administration to actually study the prison system here, but ended up traveling far and wide and up and down the country, and ended up writing a 2-volume book about it called Democracy in America, which to this day is one of the classics of American political science. In fact, and you may already know this, if you major in government or political science, I guarantee you won't get a degree until you've studied it in one class or another, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. That and the Federalist Papers are the staples of sort of a basic fundamental foundation for a government degree. Now maybe you can get by with doing the Cliff Notes or whatever, but it is going to be assigned to you at some point, and it's well worth reading. This is a brilliant thinker as well as political leader. Tocqueville said in the book I just mentioned, in America, the majority raises formidable barriers around the liberty of opinion. Within these barriers, an author may write what he pleases, but woe to him if he goes beyond them. Which I think has resonance actually even right now. So he's saying, okay, freedoms are important to Americans, but because the public has so much power in a democracy, as the United States is or is fast becoming, it's not always tolerant of people sort of speaking out against the grain, going against the majority. So in that little quote, you can see one of his issues and some of his uncomfortableness with democracy. The conservatives, tradition is a good thing, and the limits of reason. Now I say tradition is a good thing from the point of view of the conservatives. A disposition to preserve and an ability to improve will be my standard of a statesman, says Edmund Burke, who you see pictured below, sometimes thought of as the father of modern conservatism. An Irishman by birth, from an Irish Protestant background, who ended up living most of his life in and around London because he became a premier member of Parliament, one of the great parliamentarians and politicians of British history. He was also a gifted intellectual and wrote many books as well. Not all of them about politics, but many of them. So the laundry list of conservative thought is pretty long here, but remember, this isn't American conservatism. The conservatives, if the liberals are or liberalism is the ideology of the middle class, conservatism is the ideology of the old order here, right? For the most part. And again, Burke and some of the others are a variation on this. But it starts with tradition, right? And tradition in Europe in part meant monarchy, nobility, church, traditional church, etc. So, but Burke is an open-minded conservative. There certainly are some that aren't, but that's why he's considered the father of modern conservatism in Europe, because it wasn't totally closed down. He says, right, the quote I read at the top, a disposition to preserve, meaning to conserve, to keep things the way they are, traditional, and an ability to improve would be my standard of a statesman. So he's saying my tendency, and he believes the right tendency, is to err on the side of caution and keeping things traditional the way they are, but improving where you need to, where you have to. but doing so carefully and only after you've thought it through quite carefully. That's a great, I think, simplification of Burke's way of thinking. Belief in some transcendent order, unlike the liberals, there still was a traditional reliance on God or something transcendent beyond this world. They believed, the conservatives, in a fixed human nature, which liberals were already, Enlightenment figures previously had already been kind of toying with and playing with. Conservatives believed, and to the extent that some of this still is part of conservatism today, and it is a little bit, this is one of them, this is still around. That there is a human nature and it's fixed. Human beings aren't completely malleable and completely open to sort of being changed by nurture. And the conservatives believed that it was dangerous to get too overconfident in human beings tampering and tinkering with nature and human nature because they might cause more mischief than they mean to. They do support some form of hierarchy, which is traditional as well, whether it be monarchy or whatever else. Liberty was important to the conservatives still by the 18th century, but thought freedom, but it must be synthesized with family, community, and sort of national duties. And Burke is a classic example of this. He believed in liberty and right to property, right to do what you want with your life, limited government, but he did believe that people aren't just individuals free to do whatever the hell they want whenever they want to. That they are bound by duties and obligations, customs to the family, to the community, and to the country. Freedom and property were linked, so that's not surprising, just said. Belief in tradition, custom, history, and evolution. Cultural evolution, that is, not biological, because that's not really around yet, at least not in the Darwinian form. So Burke is most famous intellectually, actually most famous today, for a book that he wrote in 1790 called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And he came out early in the French Revolution denouncing it as a British politician, but that's a few years before the Reign of Terror, when the revolution was in its more mild phase, and he already had nothing but scorn for it. And it's a brilliant treatise, which was controversial. Thomas Paine responded the next year with his own book, countering it and opposing it. But it's here, more than anywhere else, where you can see Burke's conservative philosophy and his where he gets the credit for being the father of modern conservatism. And he wasn't totally a conservative. I should also point out, again, that the quote at the top in red is relevant here again, because much of the time in his role as a politician, elected member of the House of Commons in Parliament, he championed liberal causes. He spent years trying to prosecute the head of the British East India Company, the most powerful country in the world, and bringing him to justice, partly for abusing the people of India. That certainly wasn't a conservative cause. He believed the American revolutionaries were correct. Now, he didn't side with them and commit treason against his country, but he did believe that their arguments about the British taxation of the colonists, he believed they were right, and he said so openly. So he didn't. To say that he was conservative is a little misleading. He was a complicated individual. But in his book on the French Revolution, the most, I think, fundamental thing that he said in criticism of the revolution has to do with tradition, custom, history, evolution. He believed that he knew that the French needed to reform, that the country was too behind and it was in desperate need of updating things, and rights were greatly lacking. He understood many of the ways in which the peasantry was suffering injustice, all those things. But he's saying what the French have done, have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. They've thrown out their entire system, that could have been reformed and probably would have been successfully reformed in a way that benefited the public. But now they've thrown everything overboard, and gone too far, and they're replacing a system that's evolved gradually over time, through history, through tradition, through custom, which is hard. That kind of experience and wisdom is hard to come by, he believed. And now they've thrown it all away, all of it. And what is it being replaced with? In his mind, and he was somewhat right, abstract, untried, untested theory, coming from philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract. And Burke thought, that's insane. You're throwing out a tried and tested government that has flaws. It needs to reform, it needs to modernize, but it certainly has had something, of wisdom there. Another conservative trend, or trend conservative thought, is the belief that human reason is limited, which you see number 9, but that because of that, humans, they tend to be good at using reason from one generation to the next, meaning sort of gradually building it up. Evolutionary reason, in a sense, to put it another way. So that each single person's stock of reason isn't that great, even if they're a genius. But over time, human beings, sort of using reason, start to build up good ideas and establish institutions and weed out bad ideas and bad institutions, or pieces of institutions that don't work. But it has to be done carefully. It has to be done with attention to what you throw out and when and why. So change must be done gradually and with circumspection, and the French Revolution was certainly not change coming gradually. You already know that. So stock of reason is limited. Human beings should be careful to avoid grandiose planning. This is also a criticism of the French Revolution that he has. He believes this is based too much on human planning. Another reason that Burke and the conservatives liked things to stay sort of traditional, if that was reasonable to do, is they tended to think that things that evolve over time without human planning tend to, most of the time, not always, tend to sort of work better than things that are planned. And if you think about it, it makes sense given what I just said, because that's letting human beings sort of work their ability to use reason and think things through over time. If you're planning something, that's basically sort of one generation, one group of people at one time planning something vast and incredibly complicated, like how an economy or in a government is going to work. And he says that human beings just tend not to be able to do that. Those things are just too complicated. Big institutions need to gradually build up. Human beings can, at one time or another, come in and tweak it here or there, make improvements, but to start from scratch and plan entire political, economic, social systems, are just these grand projects and what we now call social engineering that conservatives thought were dangerous. They also believed that there's always trade-offs, that they're not any perfect answers. And here they differ from the liberals quite a bit as well. Even some of the philosophers tended to be, believers in the possibility of perfecting human society and perfecting humankind. And the liberals, Jeremy Bentham, for instance, utilitarianism, tended to think in terms of solutions. There's a problem, we'll solve it. The conservatives thought that's too ambitious. Again, it's unrealistic. There's always trade-offs. There's no perfect answers. There are sometimes better answers. The trade-offs we have to make, okay, we're going to do this. It's better to do it this way than the other way, but there's still going to be some, negatives to it as well. So there aren't really solutions so much as there's always trade-offs that have to be made. Burke's great for a pithy quote, as brilliant thinkers and writers often are. He said, "It's a general popular error to suppose the loudest complainers for the public to be the most anxious for its welfare." Right? To read it again. "It's a general popular error to suppose the loudest complainers for the public, meaning in favor of the public, to be the most most anxious for the public's welfare." You can interpret that on your own, apply it where you think fit. On the right, he says, "Whenever a separation is made between liberty and justice, neither, in my opinion, is safe." So the conservatives were still committed to liberty, and in that sense were aligned with the liberals, but their sense is more limited because they also believe, as Burke strongly did, that human beings have larger commitments to family, community, country that do sometimes get in the way of individual liberty, rightfully so. Socialism, last on our list, but not least. This is an ideology kind of aiming at a different group. So if the liberals are the ideology of the middle class, capitalists, and the conservatives of the ideology of the old order, traditionalists, the socialists are the ideology of the masses, the working class. And one well-known historian, at least talking about at least 19th century socialism, said that it was a cry of pain from the masses. And there's an emphasis on the collective here, an emphasis on equality more than on liberty. Henri, the Count de Saint-Simon, one of the early socialists in Europe, said it's a question of organizing a totally new system. Totally new system. Right? We already know what Edmund Burke would think about that. So there's a big difference between the conservatives and the socialists, at least on that front. They did have one thing in common. They both tended to be critical of industrial capitalism. Remember, the Romantic conservatives were critical of industrial capitalism. The politicians were somewhat as well, that were conservative in orientation. In socialism, there's a moral concern for the plight of the masses, and that's sort of the main sort of driving force. Although most of the times, and Saint-Simon is a great example since he was a member of the nobility, most of the time the leaders of the working class aren't members of the working class. They're usually middle class or even elites. That's even true now. Once in a while, there's a working class guy that sort of rises to the top in socialist circles. Socialism is a rejection of capitalism on both moral and economic grounds, believing that it's totally unjust to the masses of people, allowing a few to benefit at the expense of the many, which could be true, of course, and it's still said today. But remember, it could seem like it's true. It could feel like it's true. It might, feel right to say that, and it could be wrong. So it's open to argument, but certainly the socialists have always believed that and still do. But they believe that capitalism didn't work on economic grounds as well. I actually think their argument there is weaker than the moral one. I think they have a stronger argument to make about the immorality of capitalism, unfairness of it, than they do about it being practically less economically practical than socialism. An emphasis on the collective over the individual. The socialists aren't against individual rights, but when sort of push comes to shove, if they have to sort of pick one over the other, they're picking sort of the collective, and equality over liberty. The liberals sort of the opposite way. They're picking liberty over equality, and so are the conservatives of the time. They believe that government and public control of the means of production, at least in the future, was the way to go. So a socialist economy, and that's really the main, not the only, but the main definition of a socialist economy, is when the means of production, meaning the major productive capacity of the country, the big industries, railroad industry, in those days textile industry, steel industry, when they're not owned by individual businesses or capitalists, but they're owned by the government / public. And they believe that then you have to then plan the economy, because if capitalists aren't making decisions based on supply and demand and competition, then government experts are going to have to do so to decide ahead of time how much steel is going to be made this year, over the next 5 years, whatever it might be. Here we also see, of course, an obvious point of clash and disagreement with the other two philosophies, so that and again, I think this is where socialism doesn't it doesn't size up very well with capitalism in terms of planning an economy, or allowing supply, demand, and competition to decide on its own without any need to plan. The allocation of resources, the non-planning way of doing it is much more efficient. I don't know anybody that would argue against that part of it. A lot of other elements of the contest between whether capitalism and socialism are better for the country or the world are open to argument. That one, I think, not as much. The socialists believed in a redistribution of wealth and property in a move towards sort of a forced equality, but one that they thought was due and fair and just. Saint-Simon said, true equality consists in each drawing benefits from society in exact proportion to his social outlay, that is, to his real capacity, to the beneficent use he makes of his abilities. And this equality is the natural foundation of industrial society. That quote sounds well and good. It could be, but I'd ask you to read that a few times and think about it. Beneficent use he makes his abilities. How do you decide, or who gets to decide what's a beneficent use of somebody's abilities? So I think that statement sounds unobjectionable to many at first, but it's certainly open to argument. Anyway, there it is. A rather long-winded unit, but this is a tough one to get through. It is one of my favorites, so I tend to be long-winded on it for that reason as well. Take care.